English Daily, the podcast.
Your English journey starts now. Hey, English learners, welcome back to your podcast, the English Daily Podcast.
Yes, we're so happy to have you here today.
Today's episode is all about something really special. We're going to teach you the triple exposure method for mastering 50 B2 level academic verbs fast.
That's right, and we're going to make it really practical for you so you can start using these verbs in your English immediately.
So whether you're a beginner or already speaking well, you'll find something useful here. This method is going to transform how you learn vocabulary.
Let's dive right in.
So Jack, before we get into the specific verbs, can you explain what the triple exposure method actually is? I've heard about it, but I want our listeners to really understand the concept.
Great question, Anna. The triple exposure method is basically a learning technique that involves encountering new vocabulary in 3 different ways. It's based on the idea that we learn better when we engage with material multiple times and through different channels.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And I love that it's not just about memorizing definitions, but actually experiencing the words in different contexts.
Exactly. The 3 exposures are, first, auditory exposure, where you hear native speakers pronounce the word. Second, visual exposure, where you see an image or representation of the word. And third, contextual exposure, where you see the word used in meaningful sentences.
Why do you think 3 exposures work better than just 1 or 2? What's the magic behind this number?
Well, the thing is, Anna, when you hear a word for the first time, your brain creates a very weak neural pathway. But when you hear it again, that pathway gets stronger. And when you see it visually, you're creating another pathway. Then when you see it in context, you're connecting all these pathways together.
Oh, wow. So it's literally building neural pathways in our brains? That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like building a bridge. 1 plank isn't enough to cross the river, but 3 planks stacked together? That's a solid bridge you can walk across confidently.
I love that analogy. So with our 50 B2 academic verbs, we're essentially building 50 solid bridges in the minds of our listeners.
Exactly. And the best part is that once you've built these bridges, they stay there. This isn't about cramming for a test and forgetting everything the next day. This is about long-term retention.
How long does it typically take to go through all 50 verbs using this method? Are we talking weeks, months?
It depends on how much time you dedicate each day, but here's the exciting part. If you spend just 15 minutes a day, you can master all 50 verbs in about 2 to 3 weeks. That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
2 to 3 weeks. That's such a reasonable time frame. And I bet our listeners are going to be so motivated when they see how quickly they can improve.
Absolutely. And we're going to walk you through each step today so you know exactly how to implement this method on your own.
Perfect. Now let's get into the specifics of each exposure, shall we? Okay, so let's start with the first exposure, auditory learning. What does this actually look like in practice, Jack?
So for the auditory exposure, you're listening to native speakers pronounce the words. This is crucial because it helps you with pronunciation, stress, and intonation. You want to hear how the word actually sounds in real speech, not just how it's written.
That's something many learners neglect, isn't it? They read the word but never hear it pronounced correctly.
Guilty as charged, Anna. I used to do that myself. I'd see a word like analyze and pronounce it like analyze instead of the correct analyze. The stress is on the first syllable.
Oh, I made that mistake too. It's so common. And then when you try to use the word in conversation, native speakers might not understand you.
Exactly. That's why the auditory exposure is so important. You need to hear the word the right way and then repeat it yourself. Shadowing is really helpful here. You listen and then immediately repeat what you heard.
How many times should someone listen to each word during this first exposure? Is there a magic number?
I usually recommend listening to each word at least 5 to 7 times. Listen the first time to get familiar with the sound. Then listen again and try to repeat after the speaker. Listen a third time and try to say it at the same time as the speaker. Listen a fourth time and try to say it without pausing. And then a couple more times to really cement it.
That's really systematic. And I love that you're encouraging active listening, not just passive listening. It's not enough to just have the audio playing in the background.
Definitely not. Passive listening is like having the TV on in another room while you're doing something else. Your brain isn't really processing the information. Active listening, where you're focusing and repeating, that's where the real learning happens.
What about intonation? Does that matter for academic verbs specifically?
It matters for all verbs, but academic verbs especially tend to have specific stress patterns. For example, emphasize has stress on the second syllable, hypothesize on the third, and characterize on the third as well. Getting these right helps you sound more natural and more educated.
And that confidence in pronunciation will actually make you more willing to use these words in real conversations, right?
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than knowing a great word but being too afraid to use it because you're not sure how to pronounce it. Once you've done your auditory exposure properly, you'll feel confident pulling out these words in any situation.
I remember when I first learned to properly pronounce comprehensive, I used to stumble over it so much. But after practicing the auditory version, it became so natural. Now I use it all the time.
What about rhythm? Do academic verbs have a particular rhythm that learners should be aware of? They do actually. Many academic verbs have multiple syllables, which gives them a certain rhythm. Words like intervene, circumvent, and accommodate have a flowing rhythm that you can only really hear when you listen to native speakers.
Accommodate is such a tricky one. People often mispronounce it. The double C and double M can be confusing.
Yeah, it's one of those words that trips everyone up. The correct pronunciation is accommodate, not accommodate. You really need to hear a native speaker say it to get it right.
That's why the auditory exposure is so valuable. These little details that make a big difference in how professional you sound.
And don't worry if it feels slow at first. The time you invest in really listening and practicing pronunciation now will pay off huge in the long run. Your English will sound so much more polished.
Okay, so we've covered auditory exposure. Now let's talk about the second pillar, visual learning. Why is seeing an image or representation of the word so important, Jack?
Visual learning works because our brains are incredibly good at processing images. In fact, studies show that we can remember visual information much better than text alone. When you see a picture associated with a word, you're creating another mental anchor for that vocabulary.
That's really interesting. So it's like we're giving our brains multiple ways to retrieve the same information.
Exactly. Think about it this way. If you only know a word by its sound, you can only access it when you're listening or speaking. But if you also have a visual association, you can access it through images as well. It's like having multiple keys to the same lock.
What kind of images work best? Are we talking about literal pictures or more abstract representations?
Great question. For action verbs like analyze or evaluate, you want to see people actually doing the action. For more abstract verbs like hypothesize or conceptualize, you might use a diagram or a mind map that shows the concept. The key is that the image should help cement the meaning in your mind.
What if a verb is really abstract and hard to visualize, like correlate or interpolate?
Those are challenging. For really abstract verbs, try to think of a specific situation where you might use that word. For correlate, maybe you could imagine a scientist looking at data on a computer screen, seeing how two things are related. For interpolate, you might picture someone filling in missing information in a graph.
I love that you're encouraging learners to be creative. It's not just about finding existing images, but actually creating mental pictures.
That's the spirit. Your imagination is a powerful tool. You don't always need a perfect stock photo. Sometimes just closing your eyes and visualizing the concept is even better.
How long should someone spend on the visual exposure? Is there a recommended time frame?
I'd say spend about 30 seconds to a minute on each visual. Look at the image, really think about what it represents, and try to connect it to the word. Don't just glance at it and move on. Engage with it.
And this is where taking notes can be really helpful, right? Drawing small sketches or finding relevant images online.
Absolutely. If you're a visual learner, creating a vocabulary notebook with images and drawings is incredibly powerful. Some of my students have created these amazing visual vocabulary journals. It's like art meets language learning.
That sounds so creative. I bet those students remembered the words much better than if they'd just written definitions.
They really did. The act of finding or creating that visual association totally shensla their understanding in a way that simple memorization never could.
What about color? Does that matter? I've heard that color coding can help with memory.
Color is a fantastic tool. You could assign different colors to different categories of verbs. Maybe academic verbs related to research are blue, while those related to argument are red. Your brain naturally organizes information by color, and it makes recall easier.
That's such a practical tip. I wish I'd known that when I was learning. And I think our listeners are going to love these creative approaches.
The bottom line is this: make the visual exposure memorable. Use images, drawings, colors, whatever works for you. The more mental anchors you create, the easier it will be to retrieve the word when you need it.
All right, we've got auditory and visual covered. Now let's dive into the third and final exposure, contextualization. This is where things get really interesting, right?
This is definitely the most important exposure, Anna. Contextualization is when you see how the word is actually used in real sentences and real situations. It's one thing to know what a word means, but it's another thing entirely to know how to use it correctly.
And that's where a lot of learners get stuck, isn't it? They learn the definition, but then they make mistakes when they try to use the word in a sentence.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen learners use analyze when they meant summarize, or evaluate when they meant judge. The definitions might seem similar, but the usage is quite different. Context is what teaches you those nuances.
Can you give us an example of how context teaches us something that definition alone can't?
Sure, let's take the word approach. As a noun, it means a method or way of doing something. But in a sentence like, she approached the problem from a different angle, you see how the verb form works differently. You need that contextual exposure to really understand both the meaning and the usage.
Oh, that's such a good example. And I bet academic verbs have even more of these tricky nuances because they're used in specific contexts like research papers and presentations.
Exactly. Academic verbs often have very specific meanings in academic contexts. Hypothesize doesn't just mean guess, it means to form a testable prediction based on evidence. That's a very specific academic usage.
And that's why we need to see these verbs in real academic sentences, not just dictionary definitions.
Definitely. When you're reading academic texts, pay attention to how verbs like argue, suggest, demonstrate, and conclude are used. Notice the patterns. Notice what comes before and what comes after.
What about collocations? Are those important for academic verbs?
Absolutely. Collocations are huge. For example, you conduct research. You don't make research. You establish a relationship. You don't make a relationship. These verb-noun pairings are essential for sounding natural.
I remember making that mistake. I used to say make an analysis instead of conduct an analysis. It sounds so awkward now that I know better.
We all make those mistakes. That's why the contextual exposure is so valuable. You're not just learning words in isolation. You're learning how they fit into the larger sentence structure.
How many example sentences should learners go through for each verb?
I'd recommend at least 3 to 5 example sentences per verb. Read them, understand them, and then try to create your own sentences. That's when you know you've really internalized the word.
And writing your own sentences is so important. It's not enough to just passively read the examples. You need to actively produce language.
Couldn't agree more. That's the difference between passive knowledge and active knowledge. You might understand a word when you read it, but can you use it yourself? That's the real test.
Concerned, what if someone doesn't have access to academic texts? Are there other ways to get good contextual exposure?
Of course, there are so many resources available. You can watch academic lectures on YouTube, read online articles from academic journals, or even use specialized vocabulary books that provide context sentences. The important thing is to expose yourself to authentic English as much as possible.
That's so reassuring. And I think our listeners will appreciate knowing that they have options.
You don't need to be in a university to learn academic English.
Absolutely not. With the internet, anyone can access high-quality academic English. It's never been easier to get that contextual exposure. Okay, Jack. Now let's get into the practical part. Can you walk us through some of the 50 B2 academic verbs we'll be learning? I want our listeners to get a taste of what's coming.
Absolutely. Let's start with some of the most common ones. First up is analyze. This means to examine something in detail in order to understand it better. In an academic context, you'd say, the researcher analyzed the data to find patterns.
And that's such a versatile verb. You can analyze texts, data, situations, pretty much anything.
Exactly. Now let's look at evaluate. This means to judge or assess the value or quality of something. The committee evaluated the proposals and selected the best one.
How is evaluate different from analyze? They seem similar.
Great question. Analyze is more about breaking something down to understand it, while evaluate is about making a judgment based on that analysis. You analyze the evidence, then you evaluate what it means.
Oh, that's such an important distinction. I know a lot of learners confuse these two.
They do, and that's exactly why contextual exposure is so crucial. You need to see how each verb is used differently.
What about verbs related to presenting arguments? Those are really important for academic English.
They're essential. Let's talk about argue. This means to give reasons or evidence to support a position. The author argues that climate change is primarily caused by human activity.
And argue can also mean to disagree, right? Like, they argued about politics for hours.
Yes, but in academic English, it's almost always the first meaning, presenting an argument or position. That's an important nuance to understand.
Got it. Now let's think about verbs for discussing research. What do researchers do with their findings?
They conclude that something is true based on the evidence. The study concluded that regular exercise improves mental health. They also demonstrate or show relationships between variables. The research demonstrates a strong correlation between education and income.
I love demonstrate. It's such a strong verb. It really conveys that you have solid evidence.
It does. Now let's talk about verbs for describing processes. Identify is really common. The study identified 3 key factors that influence student success.
And that's different from recognize or find. How so?
Identify specifically means to point out or specify something. It's often used when you're naming or selecting something specific from a larger set. From all the candidates, we identified 5 who met the criteria.
That's a really precise distinction. I think our listeners are going to appreciate these nuances so much.
That's the goal. These are the kinds of distinctions that take your English from good to excellent.
What about verbs for discussing theory and concepts? Those can be tricky too.
They can be. Let's look at hypothesize. This means to form a testable prediction. The researcher hypothesized that sleep deprivation would impair cognitive performance.
And that's different from just guessing, because it's based on some existing knowledge or theory, right?
Exactly. A hypothesis is an educated guess, not a random guess. It's based on some preliminary evidence or theory.
What about theorize? Is that similar?
Similar but different. Theorize means to develop or propose a theory. Several scientists have theorized about the existence of dark matter. A hypothesis is more specific and testable, while a theory is a broader, explanatory framework.
These distinctions are so important for academic writing. I wish I'd had this kind of breakdown when I was learning.
That's exactly why we're doing this episode. We want to give learners the kind of deep understanding that textbooks often don't provide.
Now, Jack, let's talk about some practical tips for success with this method. What are the things that learners should do to get the most out of the triple exposure method?
First and most importantly, be consistent. 15 minutes every day is much better than an hour once a week. Language learning is about regular exposure, not marathon sessions.
That's so true. Consistency builds habits, and habits build long-term memory.
Exactly. Second, be active, not passive. Don't just listen to the audio while you're doing something else. Sit down, focus, repeat out loud, write the words, engage with the material.
What about people who say they learn best while doing other things, like listening to podcasts while commuting?
That's fine for review, but for initial learning, you need focused attention. Use your commute time to review what you've already learned, not to learn new material.
Oh, that's a great distinction. Active learning for new material, passive review for reinforcement.
Exactly. Third, use the words in real communication as soon as possible. Don't wait until you feel ready. Use them in emails, in conversations, in presentations. Making mistakes is part of the learning process.
I love that you're encouraging learners to be brave. So many people are afraid of making mistakes, but that's how we grow.
Absolutely. Nobody speaks a language perfectly from the start. Every mistake is a learning opportunity.
What about common mistakes that learners make with this method? What should they avoid?
One big mistake is skipping the visual exposure. Some learners think they can just listen and read, but the visual component is really important for building those additional neural pathways.
Another mistake is rushing through the examples. They might glance at a couple sentences and think they understand, but they haven't really internalized the usage.
Exactly. Take your time with the contextual exposure. Read each example sentence carefully. Try to figure out why the verb is used in that particular way.
What about the trap of learning words in isolation? I think some learners fall into that trap.
That's a huge one. Learning vocabulary in isolation, like memorize a list of words with their definitions, is one of the least effective methods. That's why the triple exposure method is so powerful. It forces you to see words in context.
And it helps with collocations, too, which we talked about earlier. Learning words and sentences teaches you which other words they typically go with.
Absolutely. One more tip. Keep a learning journal. Write down new words, create your own example sentences, draw little sketches. The act of writing reinforces learning.
I love that idea. It's like combining the triple exposure method with the learning styles that work best for each individual.
That's the beauty of this method. It's flexible. You can adapt it to your own learning style while still following the core principles of triple exposure.
Okay, everyone, now it's time for our vocabulary breakdown. We're going to go through 15 key phrases that you'll encounter as you learn these B2 academic verbs. Jack, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Let's start with to analyze. This means to examine something in detail in order to understand its components or meaning. Example, the scientist analyzed the samples under a microscope. A tip, don't confuse analyze with summarize. Analyzing goes deeper than summarizing.
Next is to evaluate. This means to assess or judge the value, quality, or significance of something. Example, the teacher evaluated the students' essays based on clarity, logic, and creativity. Common mistake, learners sometimes use evaluate when they mean calculate. Evaluation involves judgment, not just computation.
Great point. Next is to argue. In academic English, this means to present reasons and evidence to support a position. Example, the paper argues that renewable energy is essential for sustainable development. Note that in academic contexts, argue doesn't mean to fight or disagree. It means to make a logical case.
What about to conclude? That one's really common.
Yes, to conclude means to bring something to an end or to draw a conclusion based on evidence. Example, based on the findings, the researchers concluded that the hypothesis was supported. Remember, you conclude a study or argument, not a person or a meeting.
Good tip. Now let's talk about to demonstrate.
To demonstrate means to show or prove something clearly. Example, the experiment demonstrates the relationship between temperature and pressure. A collocation tip, we often say clearly demonstrate or successfully demonstrate because demonstration usually involves proving something conclusively.
What about to hypothesize? I know that one's important for research contexts.
Yes, to hypothesize means to form a testable prediction based on some evidence or theory. Example, the researcher hypothesized that caffeine would improve memory performance. Important, a hypothesis needs to be testable. If it can't be proven or disproven, it's not a hypothesis.
That's an important distinction. Now let's look at to identify.
To identify means to recognize or specify something. Example, the study identified 3 main factors contributing to employee satisfaction. Collocation tip, we often say correctly identify or clearly identify because identification is about being precise.
What about to establish? That's another common academic verb.
To establish means to set up, create, or prove something definitively. Example, the research established a clear link between smoking and lung cancer. You can also establish a relationship, establish credibility, or establish guidelines.
Now let's talk about to examine. This is similar to analyze, but maybe a bit broader.
Good observation. To examine means to inspect or study something closely. Example, the committee will examine the budget proposal next week. While analyze implies breaking something into parts, examine can be more general, looking at something carefully from various angles.
What about to investigate? Is that similar to?
To investigate means to conduct a formal inquiry or study. Example, police are investigating the circumstances of the accident. It implies a systematic process of gathering information, often to uncover facts or determine the truth.
These verbs are all so related but have subtle differences. That's why context is so important.
Exactly. Now let's look at to compare and to contrast. These are often used together.
Yes, what's the difference?
To compare means to examine how things are similar. To contrast means to examine how things are different. Example, this study compares the education systems in Japan and Finland. Then, by contrast, Finland emphasizes creativity over standardized testing.
That's such an important distinction. I know learners mix these up all the time.
They do, but now you know the difference. Moving on to synthesize. This is a more advanced verb that means to combine elements into a coherent whole. Example, the researcher synthesized data from multiple studies to draw conclusions.
Synthesize is such a powerful verb. It implies creating something new from existing parts.
Exactly. Now let's talk about to justify. This means to provide reasons or evidence to support a decision or action. Example, the company justified the price increase by citing rising production costs.
What about to specify? That's another common one.
To specify means to state explicitly or in detail. Example, please specify your requirements before we begin the project. It's about being clear and precise, not vague or general.
And finally, let's talk about to recommend. This means to suggest something as being good or suitable. Example, the report recommends implementing the new policy in stages.
Great one to end on. These 15 verbs are just the beginning. As you continue with the triple exposure method, you'll master all 50 and become so much more confident in your academic English.
Okay, everyone, it's time for our reflection questions. These are questions for you to think about after today's episode. Grab a pen and paper if you'd like to write down your thoughts.
First question, which of the 3 exposures do you think will be most challenging for you? Auditory, visual, or contextual? Why do you think that is?
Second question, how do you currently learn new vocabulary? Are you using any methods similar to the triple exposure method, or is this completely new for you?
Third question, think about an academic verb you already know well. How did you learn it? Was it through hearing, seeing, or reading in context, or a combination?
Fourth question, what's one thing you can do starting tomorrow to incorporate more visual learning into your vocabulary studies?
Fifth question, how often do you use new vocabulary in your actual speaking or writing? If not often, what might help you use new words more quickly?
Sixth question. Among the verbs we discussed today, which one excites you the most to learn? Why?
Seventh question. Think about a time you made a vocabulary mistake in English. What did you learn from that experience?
Eighth and final question. How can you adapt the triple exposure method to fit your own learning style and schedule? Be specific.
Ninth and final question. What other areas of English vocabulary would you like us to cover using this method? Academic verbs? Business vocabulary? Everyday conversations?
And 10th and final question. After learning these 50 B2 academic verbs, how do you imagine your English will change? What kind of conversations or writing will you be able to handle that you couldn't before?
Take your time with these questions. Reflection is a crucial part of the learning process, and thinking deeply about your learning will help you improve even faster.
And that's all for today, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this episode on the triple exposure method.
Remember, with just 15 minutes a day, you can master 50 B2 academic verbs in just 2 to 3 weeks. It's an investment that will pay off huge in your English proficiency.
If you found this episode helpful, please share it with other English learners who might benefit. And don't forget to subscribe to the English Daily Podcast so you don't miss our future episodes.
Thanks for joining us today, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Your learning journey doesn't stop here. Keep improving your English. Click the next video or explore more episodes we've picked just for you. See you in the next lesson.